This episode of Dorking Out is brought to you by Planet Express. Our crew is replaceable. Your package isn't.
And the letter C. C is for cookie. But that's not really good enough for me. You know, flowers would be nice.
Houston, flight is go.
Myla, let's go. SPM. Safety contact.
From Assignment X, Amalgamated Storytelling, and thesoniashow.com, it's Dorking Out with Sonia Mansfield and Christopher Allen Smith.
Welcome to episode 66 of Dorking Out, a podcast for people who like to dork out about stories and culture that we love. That means movies and TV, usually, books and podcasts, sometimes, and everywhere else where we find stories that interest us. This is the Kingsman, the Ken Burns' Star Trek edition. With me today is my co-host, professional writer, and author of The Sonia Show, a detailed examination of the Romanoff family, Sonia Mansfield.
Hey there.
Hey there.
With me today is my co-host, Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, compulsive liar, and nerd author, Christopher Allen Smith.
The author's one of the lies.
In this week's episode, we review Kingsman: The Golden Circle, which topped the weekend box office with $39 million. We also talk about Atomic Blonde and wonder if the spy genre is at a crossroads. Are either of these movies any good, and are they the next James Bond?
No.
I think Smith and I do not agree on the answer to these questions. In our second
You do
segment,
think they're the next James Bond? All right, sorry, keep going.
Well, some of the questions.
Okay.
In our second segment, friend of the show, Mike Richman, our favorite hobbyist historian, joins us to talk about the new Ken Burns documentary series, The Vietnam War. No spoilers. No spoilers, right, Smith?
I promise nothing.
Okay. And in our final segment, this is the best part, we kick off our weekly recaps and roundtable discussion with Jeff Bond and Alexandra August about Star Trek Discovery, which premieres Sunday night. So
last night. That's last night.
Yes. And we've been talking about the show for more than a year. What did we think? We have to get on with the show so you can find out. Hey, want more Dorking Out?
Yep,
You can visit our website at dorkingoutshow.com.
you can.
And you can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter.
On Twitter.
Do you listen to us on iTunes?
Yep.
It's cool.
It's cool.
We won't tell anyone.
Nope.
Please take a few minutes out of your busy day of pretending to work while you watch cat videos to give us a review on iTunes.
Cat video.
For some reason, iTunes really cares about reviews, and it helps us attract more listeners. And you want us to have more listeners and be popular and cool, don't you?
Yep.
Of course you do.
Yeah.
And now, on with the show.
Yeah. Topic 1. Kingsman, The Golden Circle, Atomic Blondes, and the spy genre in general. On Friday, The Kingsman, The Golden Circle, the sequel to Matthew Vaughn's irreverent spy hit of 2015, opened to mild reviews, and we will have our review in a minute. But in this segment, we also wanted to talk about this summer's Atomic Blonde, Charlize Theron's entry into the genre, which is maybe still ruled by James Bond, 007 himself. Atomic Blonde was directed by David Leitch, who also co-directed the energetic gunfight movie John Wick. That movie struck a lot of action fans as a fun, modern take on the gentleman spy genre. So where do all these new movers and shakers leave us? Jason Bourne, out! I think we talked about that last year. I don't think anybody's thought or wondered about Jason Bourne. The spy genre seems to be kind of at a crossroads because as Atomic Blonde was much lauded, it underperformed pretty significantly at the box office. I don't think we're going to be seeing a sequel to that. So, agents, your mission today is to discuss the state of the spy genre. First, Sonia Mansfield, as someone who did not see the first Kingsman, what did you think of Kingsman: The Golden Circle?
I didn't like it. I didn't like this movie at all. I really wanted to like it. I didn't like it. I thought it was mean-spirited. I didn't think it was any fun. It made me feel bad while I was watching it like, it just bummed me out. I thought it was weird that a movie could be like really frenzied and hyper, but it still seems so slow and lazy. I never laughed. I rolled my eyes a lot. I checked my watch a lot. I just did not like this movie. I wanted to like it.
All right. Interesting.
I mean,
oh, keep going.
You had mentioned to me that you thought maybe this could be like the next like Bond type series. That's what you mentioned to me like a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, when we put this on the schedule a couple weeks ago, and The Kingsman was one of the big movies starting the fall. Yes, that was a question in the air. I don't think it's a question in the air anymore. Anyway, keep going.
Well, I was like, is this like is this like for the people that super love like the Roger Moore James Bond, and that's like that's not the one I love the most. So maybe that's why I didn't like the movie as much. Is that accurate? Because I haven't seen the first one at all. So
I think in a weird way, The Kingsman, it kind of coalesced for me after watching Kingsman 2. I think The Kingsman is a reaction to the current slate of spy movies, which they're all very intense, very dour. Even James Bond now is pretty gruff and blunt and not that fun. It's very intense and exciting, but not that fun, not that funny. You know, if you look at the James Bond series with Daniel Craig, which is my favorite Bond, but I see what people are saying when they say it's just too down and too...
Yeah, well, it's not fun. Yeah. It's dark.
Yeah, it's dark. Then you look at the Jason Bourne series, which I love the first three, but all of those are everybody's corrupt and everything's awful and everybody's having fights in stairwells and it's down and sad. Then there's John Wick, which the humor in John Wick actually comes from how insanely over-the-top violent it is.
Right.
Then there's Atomic Blonde, which is very down, very dark, very depressing, very hyper-violent, and, you know, it's one of these agents where it's hyper, where they're so hyper-competent that we're not afraid. You know, one person can take on 20 people and they're going to come out on top, that kind of thing.
I actually disagree with some of that.
Well, okay, but I think a lot of it is the current state of the spy genre is pretty down. And The Kingsman is kind of like, hey, we're not going to forget that these are also supposed to be fun and have crazy gadgets and they're supposed to be humor and kind of ridiculous villains and almost, you know, cartoony plot sometimes. So it seems to be the only one playing in that sandbox. So I think the reaction to the first Kingsman was one, wow, this is kind of a surprise. We didn't really expect much from this movie, and it was a lot of fun. And two, we still like spy movies that have some kind of vibe of fun.
Well, you know, I think Melissa McCarthy's Spy was fun. That came out in 2015. It
did, but I think that was meant more as essentially a comedy, rather than because and I could be wrong, but
it had all kinds of gadgets and violence and
it had like comedy violence. I don't think it had like real action violence, and I think that's what I think that's what a lot of people, or maybe I'm just speaking for myself. What a lot of people like in the spy genre when it's done right is it really is you get kind of the thrills of action, the thrills of intense, you know, suspense, but you also get humor and lightness and fun and ridiculousness. You know what I mean? Like, like all of these things that we're talking about are there in the Austin Powers movies, but you know the action is not there. It's they're there for laughs, and I would put as much as I like Spy, I would put that kind of in the Austin Powers, which is mainly there for laughs.
Do you think I would like the first Kingsman?
Maybe. Well, that is one thing, is that I liked Kingsman 2 more than you did. But it gave nothing to people who hadn't seen the first one. And
Right.
this is...
And well, here's the thing. I don't think it needed to. Like, you can tell, like, I understood, like, who everybody was.
Right.
And I understood their relationships.
Right.
Like, it's not complex. Like, I get it.
Right.
But ultimately, I was like, these movies have to stand on their own. They can't just be episode 2,
Exactly.
kind of thing. So,
Yeah.
like, I was like, I didn't feel like it was a big deal for me not to see the first one.
Yeah.
But then halfway through this movie, which is ridiculously long, by the way, 2 hours and 21 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
This movie's too long.
Right.
It is not a serious movie with something to say. It is a lame spy spoof. It has no business being this long.
Agreed.
Like halfway through this movie, I was like, oh, maybe I needed to see the first one just so I would have understood better what the tone was supposed to be. Because
Yes,
the tone
I
seemed
think so.
really wrong to me.
Yeah. I think the
Like,
tone...
I just thought the movie was so mean.
This Sonia and I, right now, just had a disagreement about what spoilers are, so I'm going to give us a little spoiler warning.
What do you think about them killing off basically every character from the first movie?
I thought that was this movie's biggest problem. Mm-hmm. The thing about The Kingsman is the first movie is essentially like a training movie where somebody becomes a spy and he's in there with a bunch of men and women as they try to become agents.
Right.
One of the cool things about that was the female agent gets in, she becomes an agent. I can't remember exactly how he also becomes an agent, but she gets in, so she's kind of like the new James Bond. And that's, it's different. The movie was it was irreverent, but it seemed to shake up a lot of these dynamics for this kind of James Bond spy movie. And this movie did the modern thing that sequels do, which is, hey, there's all this stuff you like from the first movie. Well, we're going to light it on fire. So we're really upping the stakes. And we're going to kill off this character, this basically the female James Bond, who could have been so much fun in this movie.
Well, and they she spends her time like helping him like with his girlfriend.
Right.
Or what, I was like, that's her role before they kill her off is helping him like get through dinner with his girlfriend's parents. I was like, that's lame. It was just, and while we're on that subject, I'm going to say it's super lame to get Halle Berry and she does like nothing in the movie. Mm-hmm. Like she's been in a Bond movie. She plays Storm in the X-Men movies. She's awesome.
She's
just
I'm not
sitting,
sure I would go that far.
And she's just sitting like on the sidelines going, oh, I wish I could work in the field, but I'm a girl and they always vote against me or whatever. And then, I was like, that's disappointing.
Well, one, she was in the worst Bond movie. She was one of the worst characters in the worst Bond movie. So I hear what you're saying, Sonia, and my heart's with you.
What I mean is
don't
that
run.
Halle Berry
I would
is
not
a
run that flag
kick-ass
up.
woman.
Well, yes, she is. But I did think. I mean, I think they made it pretty clear. They made it somewhat clear that the people keeping her out of the field were also a villain in the movie. So, but I agree. And actually, this is one of the reasons I'm excited to talk about Atomic Blonde in association with this is because there are a lot of tropes. One of the reasons I like Casino Royale is because it took all these tropes that had calcified onto the James Bond series and shattered them all, started from scratch, and then kind of built up again. A new series, which is why I think that series is as vibrant and fun and engaging as it's ever been. I had the hope that the Kingsman would kind of do that, and I think that Atomic Blonde kind of did that a little bit, which is you have this really accomplished, really hyper competent, really sexy agent doing all the things that a hyper competent, hyper-aware agent does in these male-led movies. And that is a really fun thing to see. To see, to see Charlize Theron use her sexuality the way that Sean Connery uses him, which is
Right.
to her way into the, villain's lair. That's an interesting kind of way to go with, the gender politics that are going around now and the way that power is distributed in the world now. Seeing a woman, a hyper competent female agent, using those powers in that way,
Right.
not being shy about her sexuality, could be really very engaging and very fun. Now,
Right.
now that I'm thinking about it, how many James Bond movies would end with a female secret agent seducing the head of Spectre and murdering him in his bed? Turns out, I got news for you people. I just figured it out. It turns out the CIA and MI6 should have been using women the whole time.
Right. Well, one of the things I liked about Atomic Blonde was I felt like this role could have been played by a man and it really wouldn't have changed much. I mean, other than, the outfits.
Maybe, yeah. And I did think that was kind of a drawback.
And no, I like that about it. I also liked the fight sequences. She was never a superhero to me. Like, we talked about this, I think, before about I liked how they fought and they would get tired. And
I did like that, yeah.
Especially one of the fights later in the movie where they're just throwing everything they can at each other. And, you see throughout the movie, she's bruised and bloody and, she's not Iron Man. She's an actual human being.
Yeah.
And I like that about it. I thought the end was really cool. And I really liked Sophia Boutella.
Yeah.
Who played, I guess, what would be the equivalent of a Bond girl in this movie. And I thought she was super likable. And I liked that Charlize Theron's character really cares about her.
Right.
So I like that a lot. I really liked Atomic Blonde. I would prefer to see that again over Kingsman.
I didn't like Atomic Blonde that much, but it's for the reason that I had fun with the first John Wick movie, but I'm kind of bored by the second one, and I'm not really interested anymore. And here's where I would disagree with you. I did really like in Atomic Blonde how the fights at the end really showed the physical toll of fighting and how you just get exhausted, and pretty soon they're kind of half standing, stumbling up, and it's kind of the end of a Rocky movie where the person who wins is just the person who has the power to stand up.
Right.
But in the first half of that movie, I think she was super hyper-confident. There was a couple fights in the apartment, I think, where she's throwing a guy off a ledge and tying something to him so she can use it to swing out, and it's just all right, come on. Which is cool.
It's very cool.
But that's the thing, is it's very cool, but the tone of the movie is also, we're real, and we're gritty, and we're serious, and we're whatever. So when you have that ridiculous, over-the-top stunt work, but they're still trying to have this veneer of, this is real, and this is serious, and we're torn up inside for our souls for the work that we do spying. It's just oh, come on. If you're going to give me stunt work like that, I want to see a Union Jack popping out of a parachute backpack or something.
So can I go back to Kingsman, The Golden Circle? What did you like about it?
Actually, I had the same thing with this that I had with John Wick 2, which is I liked the world that they were building much more than the story that they told in it. I liked the details of the American spy agency, which is the Kingsman was always essentially kind of this, let's take all of the ridiculous tropes and stereotypes about Britain and boil them down into a spy agency. And they've kind of done the same thing with the Americans. I would love to see more movies and more spy agencies around this world where they take these ridiculous, it's almost like one of those geographic storybooks in third grade
Right.
where an entire
right.
culture is boiled down to one person wearing
Yeah.
one outfit
Right.
on
They
the.
wear cowboy hats.
That's right. Americans wear cowboy hats, and Russians wear,
I will. Yeah, I will say I did like um Channing Tatum. Like
Right.
he is so game
Yeah.
in everything he does
Yeah.
that I have to like a lot. I think the first time I saw him was in one of those Step It Up movies, and I was like pretty indifferent. I was like, what a hunk of meat, what a lughead or whatever.
Right.
But he's actually really grown on me, and I
Yeah.
love how game he is in comedies to go there, and he's just a likable dude.
He
and
is. Yeah.
I feel bad crapping all over the movie because I know other people
Oh,
like
why?
it. So
No.
I do want to say I super love Colin Firth always.
Right.
And I did get really excited at the idea of getting to see Colin Firth like kick some ass. But then the scene kind of turns into
Well, yeah. Then you need to see the first
something
one.
else. So I was like, maybe I need to see the first one because then I would get to see, because he does look awesome in a suit.
Yeah.
He's very, very dreamy. And the lead guy's very likable too. And,
He's fine.
But the movie's not for me. I didn't like Julianne Moore as the villain. I didn't like her plot.
Yeah.
Really bummed me out.
Yeah.
Like it just,
Yeah.
wasn't the right movie for me.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think it would be interesting to see if you did like the first one, because the Colin Firth fight scene in this movie mirrors a fantastic and really fun and really light fight scene in the first movie. So, but thank you for mentioning that, because that, for me, coalesces what's wrong with this movie. Is, we're doing the thing where Colin Firth does his thing, and it's different this time because he's been sick or he's been recovering, so he's not as good. And see what we're doing? We're doing a mirror for the scene. It's like, no, don't do that. Don't. They did that a lot in the '80s sequels, where they would have some famous scene in the first movie, and they would nearly copy it in the second movie, and it's just like, no, you're wasting time.
There were so many guest stars, and I kept thinking, I was like, oh God, this is like one of the Austin Powers movies. It's like Goldmember or whatever, where they just bring in people just to bring them in.
Yeah. Actually, that's what I was thinking. I just want to say one last thing. Julianne Moore, I think, was really wasted in this, and her plot's fine. We need some sort of, villain of the world plot, but just her layer and her thing was just so tortured and working 3 times harder than it needed to provide what it needed for the movie. So this was one of those things where the world that they were creating for these stories to happen in is much more interesting than the story that they chose to tell.
Like,
I think
nothing in this one worked for me.
Yeah. So, that's actually finally the last thing my last thing is, I was thinking a lot about Austin Powers when I came out of this, which is the thing about parody movies is, you need, when the first Austin Powers movie came out, it was like, yes, finally. They, it's essentially an open secret with Bond fans and with the Bond producers, which is they destroyed the Bond series. When they sent it up and made fun of it and took it apart in that first Austin Powers movie.
That's how you get a Daniel Craig in Casino Royale, because they can't do it.
Yeah, we have to stop because we have to stop. But then, so you have this parody, and it's funny and it's great. And then the second one is, it's funny, it's great, it's fine. And then the third one is, look, we had 17 movies built up to parody for the first one.
Yeah.
We had 2 movies built up to parody for the second one, and then it's kind of like you can't do parodies and have them be as sharp and incisive and witty at the same pace that you're doing the actual regular movie. Which brings me to the Kingsman, which is, it was making a lot of comments and a lot of tweaks and a lot of fun at the James Bond series, and they kind of explicitly say it in the first Kingsman. The second one, it's kind of like it's got to stand on its own. It's got to stop referencing those things and bring enough of its own strength to kind of sustain the series. And I thought it brought a lot of imagination to the world, but it was just, yeah, this particular story I wasn't thrilled with, so I don't know if I'm looking forward to any more Kingsman movies. We'll see.
Well, I hope there aren't any more. What do you give it? What's your number?
I would give it a 6. Like a 5.5, 6. There are things I liked about it. It was fun. Bruce Greenwood was playing a president. He played the best president I've ever seen on film, which is JFK in 13 Days. He played another president who may also actually be in the White House in this movie, which I thought was really fun. Watching
I didn't like it at all.
Watching him be an awful president. I
guess I was not in the mood.
Well, that's true.
Too soon.
That's right. Well, you know what it is? That's the thing is, I think I just love Bruce Greenwood being a president so much that I will watch him be any kind of president.
I would say I'm giving this movie like a 2 or 3.
Yeah.
I didn't like it at all.
Interesting. All right. Well, that's the Kingsman, the Golden Circle. Now we're on to something lighter, Vietnam.
Daytime, nighttime, to get the right time, call Meridian 71212.
That brings us to topic 2, Ken Burns' Vietnam War mega documentary. One of the problems we don't talk much about when it comes to this show is this is a show about stories and stories that we love. And one of the problems is we got to put out a new episode every week, even if there's not necessarily a story that we love. So a lot of times...
See segment 1.
That's right. So, a lot of times it's like stories we watched or read or listened to that were frankly kind of, they're past the time, but that's the show. This week we do not have that problem. Last week, legendary documentarian Ken Burns released, along with his co-director Lynn Novak, The Vietnam War, a 10-part, 18-hour examination of America's involvement in that war. Parts 6 through 10 started last night and will run through this Sunday on PBS. So by Thursday, you will be able to watch every minute of this 18-hour epic. And I'm showing my cards right here by saying you have got to do that. This is a great achievement by a great filmmaker and stands alongside, maybe even above, his previous achievements, the Civil War, the Roosevelts, Mark Twain, baseball, jazz. It might be the best thing he's ever done, and the fact that I'm even saying that, given the impact that the Civil War had on me, I don't even know what else to say. So,
that is really high praise coming from you.
To discuss. Thank you, Sonia. I don't mean to ignore you. You're right, it is high praise coming from
Why
you.
should today be any different?
That's right. To discuss, we brought back friend of the show, Mike Richman, co-host of NorCal News Now, but more importantly, our favorite hobbyist historian. Now, before we watch these, Mike he warned me when I asked him to come on the show, he might not necessarily be a big fan of Ken Burns. He might not necessarily think Ken Burns' treatment of the Vietnam War would be what the story of the Vietnam War requires. He warned me he was thinking this could be a big misfire. Mike, what say you? You've watched parts 1 through 5. Tell us what you think.
It is not a big misfire, but it is not as good as his previous work. Quite frankly, it's nowhere near the work that the Civil War was. And I'll tell you why. Primarily, that's because of the source material. And it's primarily because of how he utilized that source material in telling his story. The Civil War, the magic of the Civil War was coincidentally, the Ken Burns effect, what they call the Ken Burns effect, where he took these old photos and the VO of actors reading letters and speeches and things and made it real, made it live as a 20th, 21st century art form. He doesn't have that advantage here. He has a lot of archival footage from the Vietnam War, and it was amazing stuff. And a lot of it was stuff I had seen before in different formats or had heard before. With that said, it's a great documentary. I mean, again, we're only halfway through, but it's a great documentary. It's not as good, quite frankly, as the Civil War or, in my opinion, as Jazz.
Okay. All right.
So
would you? Actually, just out of curiosity, would you count Jazz as kind of his second best work?
Yes, and the thing about Ken Burns' work is that it's a very intimate art form, the way he does documentaries, and a lot of it is kind of how you come to it at that time in your life. I mean, certainly Jazz hit me really hard because I knew nothing about jazz. I mean, I'm the kind of person that is really interested in stuff I don't know a lot about. Chris, you said that I like history. I've read a lot of history. I have. I've studied a lot of history, took a lot of history courses as I can maybe remember at Rutgers 30 years ago. I don't remember much, but I remember some of them. Read a lot. I've read a lot since then. And I actually took an entire course in Vietnam, actually, somewhere in 1987, I think. And it was a lot of what I learned there and a lot of what I'm hearing and seeing in the documentary that Ken Burns did here was stuff that I knew about. But again, I studied it pretty intensely. So the more casual student of history or the more casual person who maybe lived through those years would, I think, get a lot out of this, especially if you hadn't seen the Civil War or jazz before. But if you had, to me, I found it a little light, a little disappointing, just slightly.
Okay.
By the way, when Mike says he took a course in Vietnam, he just means that he saw Platoon.
That's right. It was the 80s.
We all saw Platoon, Mike.
We all think it's great. It's a world-changing movie. It shook us to our core. We got it.
I barely remember, but yes, it was something like that. Platoon was definitely part of the syllabus.
We all remember the Platoon, the Vietnam War fad of the 80s.
It was so hot.
All right.
It was so in.
Oh, my God. Yes. Okay. So there you go. There's my bona fides.
All right.
If I pronounced that properly, which I didn't, but okay.
Now, Sonia, my friend, my co-host, has watched almost none of this.
I watched the first episode because for some reason I had it in my head that it started this week. So I was screwing around all week watching things that were not homework for the show.
Those are the kind of study habits.
And then texted you and was like, I didn't know that it was this week. I'm really sorry. So
those are the study habits that she learned at Chico State. But anyway, right. Sonia, so you watched the first episode.
I did watch the first episode, and one of the things I'm really looking forward to about this series is I always felt like every history class I ever took stopped before we got to the Vietnam War.
Right.
Like it was always like, here's World War II. This happened. Maybe we talk about the Korean War, and then we, talk about MASH, and then maybe they'll show us Platoon, and now it's something. Like we never talked about Vietnam. So what I know about Vietnam, I either got from movies or TV shows or things like that. So I'm excited to kind of learn more. And even I just watched the first episode last night and I was like, I didn't know a lot of that because I'm kind of a dum-dum when it comes to history.
Oh, stop.
It is very accurate. I will say this. It's meticulously researched. And from what I can gather, from what I've read about this conflict and this long era in American history, it is very, very accurate. I found myself agreeing and nodding with everything.
I talked to my mother today about it and she grew up in the 60s and she's like, this was my era. And she's like, I didn't know a lot of what I'm seeing here. You know,
Right.
and she was just very into it and very moved by what she saw. And she's just not a documentary person. So I was surprised that she was watching it at all, to be honest. And her review made me even more excited to plow through. I've seen a lot of these other ones that Ken Burns has done, but I really love the baseball one. That's the one that's my
Right.
favorite.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Because I love baseball, and then to watch something and learn even more, you know, that's my jam.
Okay. Well, I want to throw this out there to kind of coalesce. One, to respond to Mike.
I want to say, Smith, I think it's crazy that you think this is better than Civil War. This is like a really big deal. When Smith and I were roommates, he watched the Civil War documentary all the time, and I think you listened to it on tape too.
Here's what's so fantastic. I got validated for something I did incredibly nerdy 30 years ago this week on Reddit. Somebody talked about how if you just listen to the Civil War, it is like the greatest audiobook ever made, which I 100% agree. You can listen to that, have the entire story told, completely understand what's going on, and it is fantastic. So anyway, but which is something I did in college. I recorded all of the Civil War onto audio tapes and took it around with me on my Walkman because I was totally hip. Anyway, point is,
the ladies were just beating down the door.
They were, actually. I don't want to talk about it too much. My kids might listen to this. My son's in the next room. Podcast
he was just
studio.
Swimming in it, you guys.
All right. So point is, I want to throw this out there, and Sonia, I think you're gonna appreciate this. When Siskel and Ebert reviewed Godfather 3, if I remember correctly, they both thought it was flawed. They both thought it had trouble. Siskel gave it a thumbs down because he said it tried for a whole lot and it wasn't able to land enough of it. So he thought that it wasn't up to Francis Ford Coppola's normal standard. So he gave it a thumbs down. Ebert went nuts, went off on him and said, you can't do this when somebody reaches for the stars and doesn't quite grasp it, but they go miles and miles further than any regular pedestrian filmmaker, and it might not be as good as his great movies, but it's still a very interesting movie with a lot going on that means a lot and has a lot to offer the audience.
He loves to champion the ambitious failure.
He does, yes. And for me, and I think I kind of come down a little bit on the Ebert side of this, and that's why, for me, I don't know if this is better than the Civil War, because I've got to finish watching it, because what Ken Burns is trying is so ridiculously ambitious. So he's, the Vietnam War, back in the 80s, I remember we joked earlier, it was starting to come back as a topic of conversation because it was so insanely raw, so insanely divisive, so insanely tough for this country to get through, that for anybody to tell a dispassionate version of it, of A to B to C, and this happened and that happened, and what it meant and what people were thinking, seems so impossible that just the fact that he's attempting something that crazy, I think is A, admirable, but B, he's landing enough of it, and he's actually successfully grappling with this insanely complex story from the side of the Vietnamese, from the side of the French, from the side of the Americans. It is just masterful, and I think one of the reasons that I think that this might, for me, has the impact similar to the Civil War, probably much more tragic, I think, is Burns does something that I've never seen any other documentary do, and I can't for the life of me understand why every documentarian since the Civil War has not taken this trick, which is at the beginning of the Civil War and several times in this Vietnam documentary, he picks out various soldiers. And he doesn't just tell you the story of, oh, this soldier on this day got in this big battle, and this is what happened to them. He will start in episode 1 with the story of a soldier when they were a kid and why they wanted to go into the army, and follow them like a thread through all of these hours. So when you get to hour 7 and, oh, this is what happens to that soldier, this is what happens to these soldiers, it hits you like a ton of bricks. It is like somebody that you know, somebody you've seen grow up, have this, get churned up in this horribly violent, horribly unnecessary war. And there were a couple times yesterday when I was like, oh, I got to get through episodes 4 and 5, and I was crying. Like it really hit me because they communicated who these idealistic, kids are, because these are the sons and daughters of the World War II generation. They have that kind of, this is what our fathers hit the beaches at Normandy, we got to play our part. But when they signed up and what the American government had them do was so at odds and so, at variance of what their idealism was, and kind of, they were offering so much more than what the task justified, that it's heartbreaking. And to watch that is, and with so many different complex threads of, colonialism, the place the America held in post-World War II, the hubris that they had, the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, to get all of that into a cohesive story, plus have it connect on such a human, emotional level, I think is just
that's what the best documentaries do. Like a lot of people like, I don't really like documentaries because they think they're like textbooks or something, and they're just going to spit a bunch of facts and dates at you, and it's not going to connect to you. But the best documentaries, and what Ken Burns always does, is there's a story there that brings you in and, touches you, and you can relate to it and you can connect to it.
Yeah.
And that's really and it's powerful because it's true.
And that's keep going, Mike.
Good. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, what I was going to say is that's another thing that I think is some documentarians do, but Ken Burns does it best, which is he tells the story as though you don't know it, as though you don't know the ending, and he only gives you the facts and at the moment that the people involved in the story have them. So in a weird way, it's like we know what happened with Vietnam. We know where it went wrong. But at the time, the thinking, because of our triumphalism coming out of World War II, because of what we'd been able to achieve, it makes a lot of sense for the power, the Robert McNamara's, the JFK's, the Lyndon Johnsons, to think, oh, we came through the Depression, we came through with the New Deal, we came through fighting the Nazis. We can do this. Is going to be a cakewalk, So all their decisions that are in retrospect are so horrible. You almost find yourself going, yeah, I guess maybe that, these choices they're making are the best of a bad lot, but maybe they can pull it off, kind of.
I think that the thing that he does, and the thing that good history and good documentaries do, is have you appreciate kind of the time and place of a thing, and why things happen the way they did, and what it means for today's society too. I mean, we're still in the era of the lessons of Vietnam. Even after Watergate, and even after the Reagan Revolution, and even after, the first Gulf War, 9/11, the second Gulf War, and the rise of ISIS, North Korea, even after all this, we're still stuck with the lessons of Vietnam as a primary guiding force for the way America looks at foreign policy. Now, we may be at the beginning of overturning that, because Trump is the kind of guy that just overturns stuff wherever he goes. But we're still in this place where every decision we make is one based on the limits of power and the limits of what American power can and should mean. And it wasn't that way, and it's hard to even remember, but it wasn't that way in the 40s and the 50s. In the 40s and the 50s, like you were saying, Chris, with the lessons of World War II, it was this idea that, well, heck, we can do anything. We're America. We beat the Nazis. We beat Imperial Japan. I mean, come on, we're going to do whatever we want in this world. And that outlook held true until Vietnam. And when you understand that, you understand why Kennedy and Eisenhower and McNamara and JFK, I'm sorry, and LBJ took the courses of action that they did, because they had this understanding that America, with enough will, if the American people would just get behind the war, they would win. American power would win.
Right.
And it didn't. We know how it turned out, but it is fascinating to watch Ken Burns peel back the layers of that onion to see how hard and painful those lessons were. And it feels like you're learning those lessons in real time, which is a pretty incredible accomplishment.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing that I really appreciate him for is I think some people might have the impression, well, Ken Burns is on PBS and Ken Burns is, he's when he talks on these talk shows, he's kind of liberal, and isn't this more PBS, NPR, blah, blah, blah. And it's really not. He really is a fantastic and balanced historian. And one of the things that I really liked about it, or I think is important, is he gets in the minds of the people of the time. And in the late 50s and early 60s, we talk about, Americans just going around the world and swinging our what, and we think we can just push our face into, push our nose into anything. But back in the 30s, we saw what happened, and that generation of leadership saw what happened when America rested and sat back. The lessons of Munich seem to be screaming in their ears this entire generation, which is, if you let things get out of hand, if you let things go too far down the bad road, and if you don't jump on them quick with a lot of firepower or with a lot of force, things can get 10 times worse 5 years later. So it is this kind of, so he really does make you feel sympathetic to the situations that these people were in. But then at the same time, is he starts in the, episode 1 starts in the 1800s and talks about the history of colonialism in Vietnam. And that's something we haven't mentioned, is they really interview a lot of Vietnamese in this.
Yes.
And
yes, they do.
They talk about how, for us, the story of Vietnam started in the 60s, ended in the 70s. For the Vietnamese, it started in the 1850s. And they were essentially fighting one war that entire time, which is the get the F out of our country war. Yeah. And it is instructive how many hard-ass Marines kind of went over there, got immersed with the culture, kept fighting, but then would turn around and say, hey, if I were in their position, I would do the same thing. These were vets that were having their friends get killed by the Vietnamese, and they're saying, if I were in their position, I'd be doing exactly what they're doing. So it's this weird situation where our soldiers were kind of, or some of them, were sympathizing with the people that they were fighting, and that's never a situation where you're going to win or where there's going to be any good outcome other than just get the hell out as fast as you can.
Well, Chris, what did you think about the production of the show as a show? I mean, I really still can't put anything above the Civil War. I mean, Civil War was the best documentary I ever saw. Yeah. And I mean, this documentary can't stand in that same room to me with the Civil War, but I get what you're saying about ambition. I mean, like I was thinking about it from the perspective of Jerry Maguire.
Right.
I read a review of Jerry Maguire once that said, well, I mean, it's a hard movie to like actually rate, because in terms of what it tried to achieve, it was like an A+. Its reach wasn't all that great. It wasn't trying to really do very much, but what it tried to do, it really achieved. Yeah. Versus like a Synecdoche, New York, which I actually happen to love as a movie, but didn't really achieve a lot of what it tried, but damn, it had a lot of ambition. Right. So, all of Ken Burns' work has a lot of ambition. I think Civil War to me was the most ambitious because it was really his first foray into that level of amount of content, delivered in that way. And I just don't think you're ever going to have one that's going to top it.
I don't think you're going to necessarily have one that you're going to top. And this could be a situation that we might reference in an upcoming topic. This could be a Star Wars, Star Trek situation where they're both good. They're both awesome. You can like them both. Everything's great. Everything's coming up
No,
Millhouse.
No,
They're both
only,
awesome.
You can only like one or the other. And
So-
anyone who disagrees is wrong.
So that's right. I really, the filmmaking I thought was a little interesting, and actually once I finish it for the story part of it, I'm going to go back and really look at it, because Ken Burns he's using a lot more archival footage than he's ever used before. He's using a lot more kind of cinematic tricks than he's used before. And some of them are not exactly landing the way that I would like. There's a weird thing where I think the fonts and the maps just don't look that great, and I can't figure it out. And he's had this problem before, I think, in the World War II documentary he did, where it's like for some reason it's almost like something technically is off. But that's quibbling for the storytelling, the visual communication of what's going on, and the emotional impact of what happens. I would say this. I really like this a lot. It doesn't quite have the poetry. I guess that is so. Maybe the Civil. Now that we're talking about this, maybe the Civil War is coming back to me a little bit. It doesn't have the poetry or the grace in some areas that the Civil War series did. It's not going to have a Death of Lincoln moment, but my kind of main thing is we tell a lot of stories in this culture. We tell a lot of documentaries in this culture. How many of them really grapple with what as a country should we do? What are the consequences of how we use our power? How do we make decisions about how we use our power? How, a lot of them pay lip service to these and kind of touch on them for a moment and then move on. This one really gets deep down into it.
See, Chris, I mean, all that's true. I mean, you're right in all of that. But I mean, to me, I think what was missing, and that the dime just kind of dropped for me as you were talking, is I think that, and this is partly a history geek thing rather than a production thing, but the stakes just aren't as high. I mean, when you look at the Civil War, for instance, as a war, the stakes of that were so high for the country, and you felt the urgent live or die kind of thing. Right. And for Vietnam, of course, it was the same. But for America, the stakes just weren't the same. It was about prestige. And I mean, you see that in the set pieces. I mean, I never want to say that obviously any battle deaths are less or more meaningful than others, but I will say that just in terms of scale, I mean, the set pieces that he does, Ken Burns does an amazing job with set piece battles and walking you through the A to B to C of how a battle unfolded and where the various forces were. And he did that with Hal Moore's battle in Ijong in 1965. And he did an excellent job in I think it was episode 2. He probably devoted 20, 25 minutes to that. It was a key battle in Vietnam. But it was a battle in which 200 Americans lost their lives. And again, I don't want to minimize that in any way. Yeah. But I mean, you look at Antietam, you look at Gettysburg, you look at some of these battles in the Civil War, 100 times that number of casualties in a few hours.
That's true.
The stakes are so much higher is what I'm saying, that the drama is built in to the history to a certain extent.
I agree with you. And when it comes to the Civil War, I mean, in a weird way, the world has this ghoulish fascination with World War II, because if the villains had been victors, the conception of the world from that point on is just something that we can't even think about. The Civil War is kind of the American World War II, in that the people on the losing side, the villains, if they got what they wanted, it would have been just a unimaginably horrible spate of years as slavery lived on. So yeah, you know what? When it comes to stakes, you're right. I do agree that the stakes are higher, the human impact is higher. You know what it is? Maybe this is what it is when I project myself into the Civil War, it's not a question of who I would fight and how I would want to do this. when I project myself into Vietnam, it's, yeah, I would be against it. I would kind of march against it. But, you know, I could definitely see myself getting caught up like some of these young idealists with their fathers who fought at Normandy. And I could see myself, you know, here, and the human story, and I guess Vietnam in that way is a little more shades of gray, and his success in showing all of those shades and how they connected to each other and tangled with each other and, you know, got suppressed from one another, I think is it. So yeah, maybe I distracted us by saying this was better than the Civil War, but it is, you know, a very close second then, I guess. For me, this is, you know, even though I am very interested in World War II and really liked his documentary, The War, for me, it's the Civil War and this, and, you know, flip a coin about which one's better. We do know which one's shorter, though. So, was there any, Sonia, did you have any other thoughts, or was there anything?
No, I need to watch more until I can finalize my thoughts. Then I also need to, you know, maybe I'll watch Apocalypse Now and Full Metal Jacket and Good Morning Vietnam and
well, Sonia, all this
Born on the 4th of July, and then I'll weigh in.
All this kind of inside baseball stuff that Chris and I are talking, because we are both huge history geeks. I mean, but I wonder. I mean, it's all this inside baseball stuff. I mean, does anybody care? I guess is the problem. I mean, you know, you always think that the stuff.
They do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Is it of interest?
That's what I was saying. I was saying like my mother was saying how she's totally sucked into this and watching it, and no joke, this is not my mom's thing. Like, she does not watch documentaries. She's like, I love to watch NCIS, and that's pretty much it. So that she's watching this documentary and finding it interesting and enough to tell me to make sure that I'm watching it. And she had all kinds of thoughts and feelings. I think it is. I don't think it's too inside baseball. I think the baseball documentary series is too inside baseball.
Well, it's super dramatic. I mean, you know, war is dramatic. I mean, it's, you know, you always think about it. It's like, well, you know, why are we honoring this horrible human endeavor of killing each other and, you know, fighting over territory and political power and all this crap? But it is incredibly dramatic, and it is incredibly I mean, I always get the sense of the amazing bravery of these men and women, you know, who are there doing their jobs and you know, having death everywhere. I mean, I can't imagine myself doing that.
Right. I cannot either.
Right.
I'm always blown away by those stories.
Yeah. Because
I know that I would be like, I have, you know, spurs in my heel and head to Canada.
Right.
Well, I mean, like you watch the first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan, and, you know, I'm just reading right now Tom Brokaw's book about the Greatest Generation, which is a couple of decades old. But, you know, he says that, you know, watching that movie, he's like, and he talked to veterans, they're like, well, it was kind of like that. It was actually a lot more intense. And you're like, what? I mean, how could it really been more intense? Or like, well, it just was the scale of it. I mean, and these people you just march into machine guns. I mean, I just can't. Yeah, it blows me away. It's not an endeavor that I respect that humanity should undertake, because it's war. It's terrible. But what comes out of that is incredible. The power of the human soul to persevere and do its thing. It's mind-boggling to me.
I'm grateful for the timing too, because I think maybe a lot of people right now need to watch this and understand like how we got there.
Right.
You know, like the Civil War, spoiler alert, was a really long time ago. I think this is something that maybe people can connect to more because it's about like their parents or their grandparents. And, you know, it's hard to imagine like, well, how did they get that? How did that happen? How did they get there? And to watch this now, it's closer to home. And I think we need it now more than ever. Just like we needed the OJ documentary last year.
Right.
Made in America.
I agree so much. And Sonia, thank you for saying that, because that coalesces kind of what I was trying to say before, is the Civil War we know who the good guys were. We know who the bad guys were. That question is settled. It's over. The lessons and the causes and the effects of Vietnam are still something as a country we have to keep in mind now, because these questions keep coming up over and over and over again. A lot of them kind of came up in Iraq. A lot of them came up in keep coming up in Afghanistan. I mean, these are the questions of the Vietnam War are still alive now. The questions of the Civil War, should we have slavery? No. They're done.
You would think so, but
no, they're done. Try as he might, they're done.
Well, what you get a sense from in this documentary is that the people that were there had a sense that they were living through history. They knew that what was happening was something that was going to change themselves and their country forever. And yeah, Sonia, you're right. I mean, it's relevant, super relevant to now. I mean, I get a sense that we're living through history right now as well. I mean, and we talked about that flip-flopping back and forth between, America being, really super interventionist, then being a little more protectionist, and then kind of trying to understand the limits of power in Vietnam, and now swinging back to this era where, our government is saying, well, we don't really need to lead the world. The world will take care of itself. And that's a huge change in the way that America deals with its place in the world. And it's a sea change. And, we're probably living through history right now. That's going to be, who knows how it's going to end up. But I mean, it's an amazing time to be living through and thinking about what comes next.
So last night, episodes 1 and 2 of Star Trek Discovery were finally unveiled to the world. We have previously discussed the tortured route to the screen. We have previously shared the laurels of our guests, Jeff Bond and Alexandra August. Sonia Mansfield may or may not be joining us here in a little bit to give her thoughts. So I'm just going to cut right to it. What did you guys think?
Ladies first.
I thought it was beautiful. Easily one of the most beautiful pilots I've seen from Star Trek. I had some issues with the dialogue, but all in all, I'm excited to see more, for sure. It's an intriguing premise.
I felt the same way. It was visually amazing, and I think someone else, I think Anthony Pascal on TrekMovie.com pointed out that this is almost more of a prequel than a pilot. Normally a television pilot sets up the characters, the location, where you're going to actually spend the series. And this pilot does not do that. Spoiler alert. For anyone, for some reason, listening to this who hasn't watched the show, all the action occurs on a different starship and a largely different crew than we're going to wind up seeing in the series. But having said that, it's all designed to set up the overall situation of the war with the Klingons, and mainly to kind of provide the backstory for the Michael Burnham character played by Sonequa Martin Green. And that is really, really ambitious, is probably the most ambitious in terms of setting up a single character that any Star Trek pilot has attempted to tackle. And I really was impressed with what they wound up doing there. I still think, Chris, what I was talking about when we initially began discussions about this, as to whether this is what this has to do as Star Trek in order to compete with contemporary television. I don't know. It definitely is, I think, operating in a more sophisticated way in a lot of levels than what we've seen from the series. So its ambitions are definitely to do that. Whether it's actually doing it at this point, I'd say it's not. But again, we're not really what we saw is not really the show yet. I think the show is going to start with episode 3.
Yeah, it felt almost like a dream sequence.
Yes.
For part of it. Yeah, just the way it was lit, everything was sort of shiny and shimmery, and it felt like you were almost. It felt like I was looking through. I'm not schooled in filmmaking to the tune of knowing how to of cameras and shooting and things like that. So I'm not sure what the actual term for that kind of filter would be. But it just it felt very dreamlike, and I kept hoping that she would like snap awake and it would like fast forward like several months and we would see her on the Discovery, or we would see her at court-martialed or something like that. We didn't, but I'm curious. Yeah, it made me very, very curious for episode 3.
Right.
Oh, that's that's actually an interesting point, because Alexandra, did you watch episode 2?
Oh yeah, I did.
Okay. So yeah, so we do. So yeah, so you do. There is a court martial, I thought all of that was interesting. I particularly like the flashbacks in episode 2, setting her character up with Sarek.
Yeah.
I thought that I loved her arriving on the Shenzhou. There's a lot of things that were addressed, visually. One thing I always talk about on Facebook is that I've heard nothing but discussion about what the show looks like visually and how, this doesn't look like it's, going to fit in with the timeline and stuff. I know when they first showed photos of that transporter room with the big parabolic reflectors, that look very antique, kind of Jules Verne, that people were saying, wait, this doesn't match, the look of Star Trek and stuff, and they explain that actually, and talk about how the Shenzhou is an older ship. I thought that was really effective.
All right, Alexandra.
Yeah, I have a lot of things to say. I'm just trying to organize my thoughts a little bit. It's
I know how you feel.
I'm just kind of, I can't really get past Sonequa Martin Green's kind of inflection in her delivery of a lot of her lines. And it wasn't until we got her flashbacks with Sarek that I was like, oh yeah, because you're kind of trying to be Vulcan, I guess, because she's a human being raised on Vulcan. So that kind of grounded that for me, but it still felt a little bit artificial, I guess, kind of the way she was speaking. And I also kind of wondered, I'm like, so did he just bring her on the Shenzhou, and did she not have to go to the academy? How is she? It was kind of, it's not so early in Star Trek history that there isn't a Starfleet Academy, and you typically do have to go to Starfleet Academy in order to serve on a Starfleet ship. But it kind of looks like that Sarek just sort of brought her along, and was like, hey, if you have an extra job, here's my ward.
Right. Yeah, I really like it, but I'm finding myself reacting to it kind of like an HBO show, especially how serialized it was. And with a lot of HBO shows, the pleasure really comes in episodes like 5, 6, 7, 8 of a 10 episode season, where sometimes you really do have to kind of plow through. Usually what it is the first episode's engaging and grabs you. Second, third, and fourth episodes lay a lot of pipe.
Boardwalk Empire is a really good example of this phenomenon.
Exactly. But at the end, you get a very high. You get very satisfied from a creative standpoint, the storytelling standpoint, when all of those threads that are laid down get cinched tight at the very end of the season. So I guess I was watching it last night thinking, oh, I like this, but I'm not totally flipping out. And then I realized, it's kind of like that. And I'm wondering if it's going to follow that pattern, or if it's just going to kind of where exactly it's going to go. I'm completely content to just let the show go where it's going to go and make my decision 5 or 6 or 15 episodes down the road. But Jeff, what were you going to say?
This is the first truly serialized Star Trek, so it does fall into either the traps or pleasures of serialized storytelling. I think that another thing I said jokingly like a year ago was that I when they first announced there was going to be new Star Trek show, is like, can we have a Star Trek show where we actually don't have a bunch of scenes with Klingons talking about honor? So they did not listen.
The
to
answer
me
is
on
no.
that count.
No, Jeff, we can't.
The answer is no. And I did think I was very impressed with the treatment of the Klingons on a technical level. This is the first time I felt like, and of course, another thing that fans have been railing about is that these don't look like Klingons, and I think that they do, especially if you look at sort of the evolution. If you look at the last Klingon, I think that we saw in Star Trek was in Star Trek Into Darkness, and actually the look is rather close,
very similar
to that.
Right.
I think this is like I said, this is the first time I felt convinced I was actually watching a bunch of aliens, like a as opposed to a bunch of guys in wigs and prosthetics, acting like Vikings. And I love that there's that moment where they kind of do that group howl, which is something that we've seen in a lot of Klingon Star Trek episodes, but here it was actually kind of hair raising and cool because you really felt like you were watching something alien. Now, on the other hand, the use of subtitled Klingon language, although is very well done, I think might ultimately work against. I thought in terms of pacing, it hurt these episodes because of just how long it took for the Klingon characters to say something that could have been said in a quarter of the time if they weren't speaking Klingon.
Oh my, I know.
And it also, I think, sets up a kind of a dramatic wall, and I don't know whether this is maybe some kind of symbolic political comment that's intentional, but it sets up a wall, I think, between the Klingon characters and the Federation characters, that it's tough for them to really interact dramatically because they're kind of speaking through translators, and there's a big lag, so you don't really feel them interacting as characters, and I wonder if that might kind of harm things down the line.
I feel similarly to you, Jeff, mostly just because I had this sort of dual point of view, or kind of contrasting point of view about the Klingons, which was, I was curious about them because everybody has sort of been whining and moaning about how they don't look quite right. I didn't really feel that way. I'm also not particularly concerned. Like they didn't look so different that I was like, that it bothered me. But I was curious to see how they would be treated, and kind of immediately I felt as though they captured the soul of the Klingon culture that we've been exposed to over the course of the past 5 series. But at the same time, I was like, okay, I'm very bored now. You guys have been pontificating for a while. Like, you're wonderful Klingons. It's pitch perfect. But I also remember why Klingons are not my favorite race in Star Trek.
Yeah.
But I really, really did like the death howl, though, just because that's something that's almost a bit of a deep cut, because we've really only seen Worf do that when Jadzia and Kayla both died. And seeing them do it in unison, it felt like an alien culture, and it felt like we were seeing the very broad stroke of something that was going to we were going to get a really close look at in the Next Generation and in DS9. So that was kind of a neat device. It felt like that sort of placed it in the Trek canon for me in a neat way.
One thing I just realized as we were kind of talking about this is it kind of coalesced some thoughts I was feeling kind of subconsciously, which is a lot of what we saw here, I think, is what a non-fan would describe Star Trek being if you asked them, what do you think of when you think of Star Trek? Oh, I think of spaceships. I think of space fights. and I think of Klingons. And there is a line in here where Michael Burnham says, "Oh, we're not supposed to be soldiers; we're supposed to be explorers," which is a line Scotty says, I think, in Star Trek Into Darkness. And I'm wondering, it does seem like it's been quite a while since we've had any kind of exploration, and I'm wondering what. I think that might be kind of where my head is bumping the ceiling of the show, which is it seems very small and to be going over ground that we've already gone over many, many times before. I do think it's interesting the way that they use these 2 episodes to set up essentially backstory and kind of origin stories, the kind of stuff that would be referenced in dialogue in some other show. Maybe we get to see the whole thing. But I'm wondering, well, Jeff, if you know any of this, or if not, or what your guys' thoughts are, if where this show is going from here, is it really all just going to be about the Klingon War, or I under the impression there is going to be some exploring, there is going to be some different stuff coming up.
Yeah, my understanding is that the Klingon War is the arc of this season, but as to how much of every episode is going to be devoted to that, I mean, clearly we know that we have episodes with Harry Mudd, played by Rainn Wilson, and if you look at there's a little teaser of kind of footage from upcoming episodes at the end of the second season or second episode on CBS All Access, and it does suggest that you're going to be there's definitely some more Klingon stuff coming up, but it does seem to show other things happening.
There's something that's wrong or weird on the discovery itself. So they keep harping on the fact that this is both an external and an internal discovery. Michael Burnham's going to learn stuff about the world, and she's going to learn stuff about herself. But I think that also applies to some mystery aboard the Discovery itself.
Right.
So yeah. I'm really, really, I'm very curious about that. I'm a little concerned. My main concern with the show is that it's going to be style over substance. And that was kind of that was really what the pilot left me with. I'm hoping that's changed, but because I am really, really curious about what else is going to happen. It did do that for a pilot, it did do that. So
I think it's funny that the pilot, in a weird way, is sort of like I remember after I saw, Star Trek: The Motion Picture, I was talking to some other guy in college with me, and he's like, "Oh man, they should have just done a war with the Klingons." So this pilot, in a weird way, it sort of seemed like the movie they would have done, if they were going to do a theatrical movie that was really. That was something they toyed with, even the J.J. Abrams movies. There was some discussion that they might do that, and they sort of never did it in terms of a film. But this, seemed very much like this kind of cinematic approach you would have done if you were going to do that. But now that's kind of done. So
right.
You have to the show is going to live or die on its characters, and we really only set up 4 characters in this episode, and we've already lost one of those characters.
I was so scared. I mentioned to Johnny, my co-host, on another podcast yesterday, that I was like, boy, it makes me nervous that she switches to a different ship from the Shenzhou, because that makes me think that Michelle Yeoh is not going to stick around, and I really want Michelle Yeoh to stick around and show up.
Right.
Oh
yeah, I sort of thought Michelle Yeoh is she's not Tom Cruise, but she's a little bit more known as a movie person. So it was cool. I thought it's very cool to have her, and I also thought the little bits of teaser footage that they showed her with, she seemed kind of stiff, and I was actually a little worried about how her performance was going to turn out. But I thought she was quite good, and she was particularly good in her conflict scenes with Burnham. So
their relationship was really compelling.
Yeah, and I've already seen a lot of people say, "Oh, I wish I could watch a show about this crew."
I'm already shipping. I'm already shipping
That's
Giorgio.
Right. There you go.
Very short lived.
It's that I think that's in terms of a pilot, they didn't have they're not really character moments for anybody outside of those four people.
What do you think of
so the focus is a little narrow, and so you do already kind of feel like the crew of the Shinzo are disposable in a way. I did like Saru. I thought that he was good at kind of a fussy character. Another discussion that people are having is whether there's enough humor, whether this is going to be all dark and serious, because Star Trek, I think Star Trek was probably the first science fiction show to successfully integrate character humor, as opposed to Lost in Space, where it was just like goofy, great,
right,
kind of humor.
It really grounded it in our universe.
Element of Star Trek.
Yeah, I think because I think they want to be they've grounded it in our universe. So to a degree, the way the humans interact, I think, has always been modeled after the way we interact today. And so the speech is always colloquial, and the workplaces are kind of familiar workplace relationships.
That's interesting because that's an aspect of the Orville that is really pushed, where they're being late 20th century, 21st century, kind of dialogue references and jokes. And here, there's, this script was rewritten by Akiva Goldsman off of Brian Fuller's, and I'd love to know what he changed. But I noticed, when, they walk onto the Shinzu Bridge the first time, and, Michelle Yeoh says, "Not too shabby." There are some things where, and I don't know, it's interesting because if you went back to whatever 1966, I'm sure, in fact, I know that there's very, very contemporary bits of dialogue and slang used there. So it's always going to be reflective of how people talk now. But Goldsman writes and directs the third episode, and he is clearly at present a major force, behind the direction of, literal and figurative of what the show is going to be. And he, he's an Oscar-winning writer, but he's also someone who's done some of the worst genre. It's like the Lost in Space movie, Batman and Robin.
The Dark Tower.
That explains a lot.
What his taste is that's something that I'm a little bit leery of. So far, I mean, I heard people, I've heard people for the past 6 months talk about this pilot as being unwatchable, and that, is a disaster, going to be one of the worst things anyone's ever seen. And I certainly did not feel that way about it. I thought it was, technically very, very well done. I thought the performances were done. I love Sonequa Martin Green. I liked her in Walking Dead, and I was really excited when they cast her because Brian Fuller had always talked about wanting to cast and I'm going to forget the name of the actress, but it's
Angela Bassett.
Always talking about casting Angela Bassett, which I thought would have been a great idea.
She probably would be the only person who could take my loyalty away from Kate Mulgrew.
And
only Angela Bassett.
Sonequa Martin Green, I think, in a really interesting way, is like a young. She seems like to have the potential to be like a young Angela Bassett. She has that, power and fantastic voice, and she's her skill as an actress or actor has always seemed to me to be, to have kind of emotions boiling under the surface, which is perfect for this character. And I love, I've heard kind of complaints about, the idea of, her being basically like a foster sibling of Spock and being, basically she's like sort of the flip side of the Spock character. But I think that's interesting. And it, the best Star Trek characters have always had this kind of duality and internal conflict. And in a lot of ways, it's almost more interesting potentially than Spock, because you have someone who's emotionally scarred and traumatized from something that they were a child, happened to them as a child, and then they've kind of gone through Vulcan training to repress all that, and then obviously in her 7 years on board the Shinzu, she's I think with the help of Michelle Yeoh's character has embraced her humanity and emotions and found that to be her strength. But I thought it was a really interesting, and I'm not sure that it completely grabbed me from a dramatic standpoint, but I thought it was fascinating having her mutiny and try to take her captain out for
that was
her own
aggressive
good.
That was crazy.
Yeah. I thought it was a definitely a surprising plot twist. It was daring, because you're taking a character, who's going to be the lead of your show and have her doing something where the audience is going, no, don't do that. So
that's not a very Star Trek thing at all. That. Like, when she did that, I was like, I don't think we've ever seen somebody who wasn't a villain. Like, that's an Edmonton from DS9 movie, which was a name drop that Johnny actually dropped in our podcast before. And I was like, that seems a little extreme. And then all of a sudden I was like, whoa, that to me was something that I really blinked at. And I wound up liking it. But it was something that struck me as something that would very much alienate, I think, or might very much alienate somebody who is a Star Trek purist, because that's just really out of bounds.
Well, it is.
And
I
hated that.
Yeah, I was very happy to see that, Jeff. One of the things I learned from you decades ago now at this point was the Star Trek reset button, and how it kind of erased so much potential drama from the Star Trek universe, where at the end of every episode they just go back to kind of the standard crew setup. And here it was like, oh, it was almost like they put that in there to show, no, we are going to have people do things that are irrevocable decisions that they're going to have to live with for the rest of their lives, and here we go. So I thought, that was one of the things that really did excite me, because that was a huge indicator that as much nostalgia tripping as we're doing with the Klingons and space battles on this, that's something we haven't seen before, and that's kind of the stuff I was most excited about in anticipation of this show, is seeing Star Trek storytelling that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, obviously they spent the rest of the, that happens at the end of episode 1, and she is, paying the price for that through the entire second episode. And if you look at the, how she's brought on board the next ship, and in the previews, it looks like she spends quite a bit of time kind of digging her way out of that hole. And that's clearly the most interesting part of the show for me. And I'm, Jason Isaacs plays her captain. He's a fantastic actor. And I would think that they would not have hired him if they didn't have some, very interesting dynamics planned between him and Burnham on the show. So, and we know that there's other characters that have been teased, not in any of the footage, but in publicity, we know that there's other important characters that are going to be part of this crew. So we're not really going to know what's going on with this show and kind of what's promising about this show until we get into the third episode. But
this made me impatient.
Yes.
Yeah, and I've seen people argue that why do we even have these 2 episodes if it's going to be a different show and a different situation? But I do like the idea, and I thought it was overall successful of spending 90 minutes, setting up the situation with this very complicated character. So I think if we would have just gotten that in a 2-minute flashback at the beginning of episode 3, it would not have been as effective.
No.
Well,
No.
yeah, and I was trying to think of this as an armchair storyteller, and I've had a feeling that Jason Isaacs' character, and I could be completely wrong with this, might actually not exactly turn out to be the villain, but turn out to be not somebody that's a traditional Starfleet captain that we've seen in series before, where they're, the moral center of the show, they're always doing the right thing or have their crew's safety or best interests in heart. And it would be interesting to almost have him be a semi-villain role, and for her to have to kind of work against that and try to convince the crew, hey, these we're not going down the right road, and for her to have.
And I swear it's not like last time. I will not get him killed.
Exactly, that's the thing.
Really, really should believe me. Like this time, it's true. There's something that would be
exactly.
I don't know. I
don't know about that. That's a great. I mean, I didn't even think about that, but that is a great, possibility that she is still, traumatized and haunted with guilt over her screwing up her relationship with the last captain, and that so she's working overtime on one level to maintain, decorum and be a good Starfleet officer under this guy's command, but that maybe he has things going on that she profoundly disagrees with. I mean, Jason Isaacs has played Satan, he's played Dracula, he's played every
Lucius
major
Malfoy.
He's played Lex Luthor. He's he's Lucius Malfoy in the Harry Potter movies, which is one of the most grandest villains. I think my biggest problem with the Harry Potter movies was there wasn't enough of him.
Oh gosh.
I think that there's going to be definitely. I would have to think that's going to be a more complex, character, and I remember this has always been something that's bugged me about Star Trek, in its last few shows, is that I have wanted to have a captain that's a little bit more morally conflicted. I remember
Janeway
watching
with that.
She did.
Yeah. And going back and looking at the there is some good conflict in that show. I always found it frustrating, watching it in its original run, because I felt like it didn't go far enough with that. Although, going back and watching episodes, there's definitely some very strong conflict. But I remember watching.
I was writing about that. It's Voyager's, like, taken in the context of DS9 and TNG, Voyager becomes a really much less enjoyable show because you want so much more from it. Yeah. But when you take it on its own, it really stands up. It's well acted, and I think Mulgrew is phenomenal. She's
terrific. I mean, I remember watching Encounter at Farpoint, and the only interesting scene I thought in the entire pilot was the one where Picard's mouth kind of twists, and as he explains to number one that he doesn't like children, and that it was the only interesting moment of Patrick's performance, and I was like, oh wow, there's going to be something unlikable about this guy, and then of course they threw that away, and they barely mention it throughout the rest of the series. But that to me, I mean, that's the classic, crusty but lovable character. This is what television is about, and that Star Trek, I think, kind of struggled with because of the whole Roddenberry, we perfected people and everyone's going to get along now. You can't, the classic TV character is someone like Lou Grant from Mary Tyler Moore, where you're really afraid of him from the opening episodes, and then gradually over the course of the series you start seeing the warmth emerge. And with particularly Next Generation, that all started like everyone's going to be warm, it's all warmth all the time, and it's only the aliens and the other people outside the Enterprise have any issues or
on the Enterprise every single day.
So that to me is what I want to see, and it doesn't mean that it's all going to be dark and dystopian, because to me the utopian aspects and the optimism of Star Trek at its best comes out of the struggle to overcome humanity's failings. And if you don't have the failings there in the first place, there's nothing to overcome and there's no drama. So that is what I hope we're going to get out of these shows, is some conflict that's ultimately uplifting and rewarding, but you still have to have the conflict there.
I think since the show is really micro focused, it seems, and I think that helps because it still feels like Star Trek overall. It feels just like a really, really a very, very, very close look at certain people and certain events. So I think it can get away with being a little bit darker, but still having that kind of, general, we're in Starfleet and things are mostly fine. I think it's going to be able to do that and pull it off and still feel like Star Trek because they've just made the point. They've really, like I said, they've just really, really narrowed the focus. You don't get the feeling that the Federation, you didn't feel like space was, it doesn't feel like the Federation, that word. It doesn't feel like a normal Star Trek playground. It doesn't feel like we're part of this like huge, vast system of planets and this huge established, not country, but group, like
Federation.
Political body. Yeah, this Federation. It felt, I really felt like kind of the vastness and the emptiness of space. It felt like Battlestar Galactica in that capacity, and I think I'm like going around in circles trying to make this point.
They're out on the frontier in almost like a Western sense. There's no one around.
Yeah,
and so they're on their own.
Yeah, and it's. I think because of that, because we're not part of this greater community, I think the show's going to be able to sort of get. I'm glad that it's going to be able to get darker, and it's not going to feel contrived because it already is set up as feeling like kind of a very lonely, disturbing area that they're in, or like mission that they're going to be on.
I'm going to bring Sonia in real quick.
Hello.
Hey, you. How's it going?
Good. Thanks for beaming me in.
Hi.
Welcome, Sonia Mansfield. So yeah, I think to reset the stage a little bit for Sonia, I think where we're at is we're hopeful. We like it. There's a lot to like. We're not completely having our heads blown off and flipping out in super love for it, but it's like a hopeful beginning, and we're all interested to see where it goes. Would you say that's a pretty fair assessment of our thoughts so far?
Yes.
Cool.
I don't know what you talked about, but I'll say yes.
Well, actually, I was setting the stage for you, Sonia. So tell us what you think.
I have to say, as someone who is, I would say, Star Trek light, I'm not as devoted as all of you, but someone who enjoys Star Trek and has been rewatching the original movies and the series. I'm really excited to kind of start at the beginning of the show. This is like the first one where I get to get in at the ground level.
It makes a difference.
So I was really excited about it. I liked what I saw. I thought it looked beautiful, first of all.
Right.
And I love the lead a lot. But I did think when she was doing the Vulcan thing, it was a little bit like she was dressed up as a Vulcan, like a Halloween costume. I don't know if you guys,
100%.
But my husband kept pointing that out too. I was like, well, maybe that's a character thing because she's not supposed to be a Vulcan. She's a human who's raised by Vulcan, but not a deal breaker. I really enjoyed the show, but I felt like when that second episode was over, I didn't really know what the show was going to be about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense.
It wasn't like it wasn't a really good pilot in that I have no idea where the show's going.
Right.
I think we talked about that, but I think we liked it.
Yeah. No, I'm fine with it, but it was also because I'm patient and I feel like Brian Fuller's involvement warrants that kind of patience because he's created so many things I like. But when it was over, I was like, oh, so it's going to be Star Trek Con Air? Like,
well, yeah, actually, yeah. Let me ask this. Thank you, Sonia, for saying that. Is the Discovery like a prison ship, or is it just a regular ship that she got shipped to, or because it almost seemed like okay, all right, because it almost seemed like in the kind of coming this season on Star Trek Discovery, like that, like she got shipped off, And that's
Well, I think that no, I think we don't know exactly at what point in the next episode she gets on Discovery. So there's some sequences in those previews that I'm not sure exactly where to place, but there's dialogue that's fairly specific in there where it's clear that she is assigned to the Discovery in spite of, or for reasons that are not quite obvious related to her court-martial. In other words, she's still, I think, been broken at this point, and I don't know what her rank is, if any, but that I think given her experience, there's something about her that they still find important and useful that they want to make use of on the Discovery, and that's why she's assigned there, and she's not aware of what is going on in that regard either.
It feels like
that's something we're going to find out.
It's like a Tom Paris kind of situation, a little.
Yeah. Yep.
Right.
Definitely.
Right. Well, I do have to say, I am not usually one to side with the carpers and the second guessers of Star Trek fandom, but that courtroom scene could not have been more dark. It was almost like a dream. Everything was lit so dark, so sinisterly. So I was a little taken aback by that. Like, I almost wondered if it was like a dream sequence or something. Did you guys have that feeling?
I felt that was one of a couple of things about the whole 90 minutes that really fell flat for me. Even in terms of, Sonequa Martin Green's performance, I felt like, the director or however that was set up, they had a clear vision of what they were going to do. Okay, we're going to, backlit everything. It's going to be very, very dark. We're going to keep, hold on Burnham while she makes this speech. And it just, that it is the dramatic climax of the episode. And I felt like it did not work. I think Sonequa Martin Green's fantastic actor. I felt like she was just put kind of caged in the concept of how that was shot, and it was not conducive to her giving a great performance. And so that was a stumble. And if you think about it, that is what you're left with. That's the end of the 90 minutes, and that's what's supposed to kind of get you geared up to watch the entire series. So that, to me, is kind of a big stumble. It's probably, from my perspective, the biggest failing.
I completely forgot it happened, so I think you're right.
Out of the pilot. Yeah, it's not. It does not register very strongly, and I think you were supposed to come away from that thinking, "Whoa, my God, I gotta see what's going to happen next," and you sort of maybe don't feel that way. That it just didn't have the impact that I think you would want to have out of that sequence.
Yeah, I found it pretty distracting, and I think you're right, Jeff, because the important information out of that scene is you're out of Starfleet, your rank is gone, you're done, you're going to prison for life. That's which they could have communicated that information in a million different ways, but I found that scene so distracting that it was almost as though they hadn't built a set. Like, I actually really started looking at the set and looking at the lights, because there were kind of pools of light and rim lights all over, and it really did look like they shot her in a completely dark room and just CGI'd a couple logos and a couple flags in under some extreme pool lighting. And that was it. And it seemed, and, this is kind of a flippant way of saying it, but like everything else in both of those episodes was so lush and so expensive and looked so good that it's like, oh crap, we got this scene, we have no money, we have no set, we have nothing. All right, turn off the light, boys. This is how we're shooting it.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, you almost wonder if it was like a reshoot or something. But it did kind of feel that way, and I feel like it was intentional, that this was like, okay, we're this is how we're going to create this stark contrast between what we've seen before, and really focus on the shock of what's happening here. But yeah, it did. Even her kind of delivery was sort of dreamlike and detached. And it's interesting what Alex said earlier, that there is a quality of like a dreamlike quality to the whole 90 minutes in a way, because of the look and the movement around in time. And I think you could have easily set the whole thing up as this is her memory of the events from her jail cell or even from the trial, but they don't really spell that out in exactly that way. So you kind of left.
I really wish they had.
Wondering
I think
how
that
intentional it was. Yeah.
Because I have to be honest, I really am a little bit worried. Like the dialogue was really, really painful for me, and it feels it feels a little bit over the top in certain areas. And I was really hoping that, with this kind of lens, looking at Star Trek through a serialized kind of microcosm of one story, that we were going to get nuance that we'd never seen in Star Trek before, that it was going to take itself seriously on a whole other level than it had before. And I didn't really, I feel like I feel like it was style over substance. I know I mentioned that before, but I kind of feel like the pilot tried to convince us that that was what was going to happen, but it didn't feel organic, and it didn't felt a bit superficial. So I was really, really hoping that she was going to snap awake, and it was going to be a lot grittier, and she was going to be in a prison jumpsuit or something, and she would be in the brig, and then it would go from there.
Right.
But it didn't. So now I'm hoping that that's still the intention, and that they just won't be as obvious about it, but we'll wait and see, I guess.
So
I watched
one thing. Oh,
I was going to say, I watched the show with my husband, who's a really big Star Trek fan, and he kept saying like the dialogue seemed really stilted, and the relationship between the captain and Michael Burnham it seemed really forced to him. And he had a hard time kind of connecting those two, and he felt like there needed to be more emotional weight there that he just wasn't getting. And he did. The dialogue for him was very like exactly what you said, Alexandra. Like he felt it was really forced, but he still really liked the show, and he felt like it's worth coming back for sure.
Well, supposedly Akiva Goldsman, like I said, he rewrote Fuller's script for the first episode. The second episode is credited to, I think, Fuller's two compatriots. So I don't know that I noticed I'll tell you, my view of Akiva Goldsman as a writer is so jaundiced that I was actually pleasantly surprised that the writing was better than I expected. But I agree. It was there's an extent to which you felt that it was written dialogue and not necessarily emerging, organically from every character, and we know that Goldsman is gonna, like I said, is gonna be guiding the show at least in its early episodes. So it's going to be interesting to see. It's basically, I think, down to him and the Fuller's two people, I think, are really the guiding forces at this point.
Right. Yeah, they're show running officially. I think that which makes me happy.
So I think that's what it remains to be seen, kind of who has more weight and who really shapes the way people talk on the show. Somebody also was asking on Facebook, okay, if you were watching the pilot for the revival of Galactica, the 2004 revival, and this, like, if you were in the middle of it, how would you feel? And I remember actually specifically watching the Galactica pilot with a bunch of friends, and us just like pretty much laughing it off the screen.
Really?
And I never even finished watching the pilot because we wound up watching it in two parts, and I think I kind of left that. We were like just thinking it was ridiculous, and because we were trying to visualize what it was going to be. I think, based on our knowledge of the 1978 show. And then I watched the first actual episode of Galactica 33, and that immediately struck me as like, this is what I always wanted Star Trek to be like. It's completely adult, and I vividly remember there's a moment where like Colonel Ty is an alcoholic, and he's actually got a glass.
Oh, he's measuring his
measuring how much he's had, and that was the moment for me where I just immediately said, okay, this is a brilliant show. And this is a show that measures up to any, dramatic TV show that's on right now. And that clearly that is not what we have so far with Discovery. And this is the thing about Star Trek. To me, Star Trek has never been able to really compete against the best dramatic TV shows, except for, and people may scream about this, but to me, it's except for the original show, the first year or two of the original series, that was actually nominated for best dramatic series up against all the other shows that were on at the time. And if you go back and look at television of that era, Star Trek then completely operated on the level of sophisticated, dramatic television of the era. But the later shows, to me, there's always been a little bit of a, okay, let's not make this too adult.
Right.
And
it felt like they wanted to
that actually, I think, even goes back to The Wrath of Khan, which is, I love and is a brilliant movie, but there's something a little bit juvenile about, like, having space cadets and so there's always been a little bit of an element in that, and I think that that is the struggle, because now we're dealing with concepts that are half a century old, and can we treat all this seriously and watch it as adults? People shooting phaser pistols at each other, and
right.
Is there a way to truly keep this adult and on that level of sophistication? That's the challenge, and this show, if this show can't do it, it's you have to wonder if it can be done on television. This is going to be the biggest opportunity to do it, and I think the show has a ways to go to reach that level.
Yeah,
I think I've been pretty quiet about my sort of hopes and dreams for this show, just because I really wanted to take it on its own merits, and I didn't want to have too many expectations going in, because I feel like the Trek expectation phenomenon hurts us more than it helps us. But I really, really, in my heart of hearts, just looking at the cast and looking at the people attached to this, wanted this to be the show that finally makes Star Trek legitimate. In terms of that kind of quality of television, that finally would make people sort of stand up. People finally admit, like, no, this is not. I want people to like the show without the qualification that, like, oh, I like it because it's Star Trek and I like Star Trek. Like, I just wanted people to like the show because it's a really good show. Like, I want that level of content. I want prestige Star Trek badly, and this is not that yet. And so that's really, the show has a lot of leeway with me, and I'm going to give it a lot of rope.
Yeah.
But that's really the one thing that I want. I want it to achieve. I want a Brian Fuller show, which I'm hoping that the more Berg and Harburg maybe get away from Akiva Goldsman's influence, that maybe we'll start to see more Brian Fuller echoes, just because they're kind of his go-tos. So
I think that's a good place to kind of look forward and kind of wrap this up a little bit. What are we hoping for now that we've seen this? Now that we've had hints, what are the things that we're hoping for from here on out? I will start with you, Alexandra.
Better dialogue. And I just wanted to keep on an upward trend. I still think this is the best Star Trek pilot we've ever gotten. I just wanted to keep outdoing itself.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I definitely think that's pretty much my thoughts. Jeff, what are you hoping for? And if you would like to sprinkle in information that you've heard that hasn't been released to the public yet, feel free.
I think I'll tell you the one thing that I've heard about Akiva Goldsman is that, which is a little negative, is that he is less interested in the, kind of moment to moment character interplay and more interested in the plot. And I think what most fans love about Star Trek and what, got them hooked on the first Star Trek were all the, little moments in between the high dramatic stakes where you would have character interplay. And that where those characters started to come to life. And I think it's problematic if Goldsman doesn't have the patience for that. So that's why I kind of keeping my eye on how much influence he has. But on having said that, I've also heard that this third episode that he wrote and direct is much better in a lot of ways than the 90 minutes of pilot that we watched. So for all I know, he might be the savior of this thing. I just want to show that is, gripping to watch. Just like Alex said, I want this to be a legitimately great television show that people watch because it's a great TV show and not just because they feel obligated to watch Star Trek. On the other hand, I'm going to watch it because I've watched every episode of Star Trek. I sat through several Star Trek series, just hate watching them. With some of them, I've gone back and appreciated them more later. There's others that I don't think that I ever will. But I am fascinated by how every era approaches Star Trek, because it's amazing that this is a 50-year-old concept that we're still spending, $8 million an episode.
And it's still so relevant. I mean, Gene Roddenberry has only gotten more relevant in the past 50 years, which I want to send him money somehow. I don't know. He's still still turning it out.
Yeah. And this is, that's something we haven't talked about. And I think it's not really, brazenly clear what the politics of this show are. There's but that they, the producers have talked about the fact that this is going to reflect, the era of Trump and our divided culture. Yeah. And I'm fascinated to see how it does that.
I was waiting for the Klingons to say something about making Klingon great again, or.
Well, they kind of do. Remain Klingon.
I was waiting for it to be really spelled out that way. It was pretty close.
Right. So Sonia, what are you hoping for?
I'll second a lot of what Alexandra said. I would like some better dialogue for sure, but also I like the term Trek expectations. I think everybody wants something different from Star Trek. We talked about that a bit last week with Jeff, the idea that you kind of love the Star Trek you grew up with. But what I really want is the same thing. I want people to say that it's an awesome show, not just it's good for Star Trek.
Right.
I want them to say it's good. So that's what I want. I think that this is an interesting start, and I'm pretty curious to see where it goes next. And like I said, I'm pretty excited just to kind of get in on the ground level. So I'm pretty easy to please.
Alexandra, I think I interrupted you a little bit. What were you going to interject something there?
No.
Okay.
It was a momentary thing. We're all good.
Okay. Well, yeah, I guess where I come down is I would like a show that I can't predict. I would like a show where without a Star Trek reset button, where and I think I'm kind of like you, Alexandra, and I'm prepared to meet the show on its own terms and just see where it goes and see what they do. I think there's a really, I don't want to say toxic, but there's a really counterproductive thread in a lot of Star Trek fans where they have a list of 15 things that Star Trek has to be. I think I have a list of maybe 3 or 4. It has to be in space, and it has to have some sort of allegory for the human condition, and anything past that, they can do whatever they want as long as it's good. So
it doesn't even need to cells. You don't even need.
That's right.
Cells.
DS9. We don't even need a ship. So yeah, I'm hopeful. We'll see. Everything that Jeff has said about Akiva Goldsman sends a cold shiver down my spine. But yeah, so that is our first examination of Star Trek Discovery episodes 1 and 2. We will be back next week with episode 3. Sonia Mansfield, is there anything else that you would like to add to this?
No, I'll just say goodbye.
Bye!
The Dorking Out Show is on Twitter at Dorking Out Show, where you can find Chris at Jet Jurgens and Sonia at The Sonia Show. You can read about Sonia's random adventures at thesoniashow.com and track the slow and creeping progress of Chris's novel and his other hijinks at jetjurgens.com. You can find out more about The Dorking Out Show at dorkingoutshow.com. While you're over there, you can support us by giving us a review on iTunes. We have a handy-dandy iTunes link to whisk you right back to 2007, where you can leave your review and 5-star rating in iTunes. We'd do it for your podcast. Want to dork out even more? Well, you can sign up for our newsletter, where you'll get all the headlines we use as fuel for the show. That's it for this week. Thanks for listening.